I'd like to introduce, first, I'm Camilla Kenyon. I work for the writing program, and I'm one of the organizers for the panel this year. This is Professor Christina Faust from Communication Studies, Professor William Philpott from History, and Professor Michael Kenyon from Mathematics. So I will introduce each of them before they give their presentation, and then we'll have plenty of time for you all to ask questions. Dr. Faust's research and teaching engage rhetoric, power, and social change in a variety of contexts, including social movements, political discourse, and pop culture.
Great, thank you so much. Thanks, Camilla and the writing program for the invitation to come. And thanks to all of you for coming tonight. I'm a little bit surprised and very pleased to see the number of people in attendance tonight, so I try to make it worth your while. As Camilla mentioned, I'm a faculty member in the Department of Communication Studies, where I have been for 7 years, and I study rhetoric, power, and social change, she mentioned. We'll get into some of those contexts here in a little bit. I'm just curious, how many of you, well, I guess all of you have to have selected your major upon entry. How many of you are majoring in communication studies? Okay, not too many. This doesn't surprise me. How many of you have ever heard of communication studies? Okay, so most of you at least heard of the major, that's good. How about rhetoric? How many of you have heard of rhetoric? Good. I'm glad all of you raised your hand. That bodes well for your writ sequence. Rhetoric, as you probably know, is broadly defined as the study of public persuasion, and it is housed not only in English departments, but also in communication studies departments, which is where I find my home. And so tonight I want to give you a little bit more of a taste for what it is I do and how writing fits into my work. So here are just a few photos of some photos of the research projects that I have undertaken since doing my dissertation, which I actually revised substantially into a book, and over the last 6 years have done various projects that are captured in the pictures that you see here. Does anybody want to guess what this photo might represent? Global warming, yes. Yes, global warming. Is anyone familiar with this guy? Do any of you know who this is? The man holding the book, for those who can't see me pointing on that side of the room. The man holding the book surrounded by the two fairly attractive women doing the Hawaiian hello. Anyone? Guesses? He's holding up his own book, which is called Radical Sun. He has another book called The Professors, the 101 Most Dangerous Academics in America. Guesses? No? That's David Horowitz. David Horowitz. He is a former, he's the son of two communist parents turned neoconservative who is on a crusade to bring balance, fairness and balance to American universities. So if you've ever heard of the Students for Academic Freedom, which is an organization that he has helped to start, he also writes several books about that. So he's one of the other projects that I've done. Who recognizes this fellow? Ronald Reagan, thank you. Yeah, you're like, duh. That's an easy one. And then this, I'm not sure if you can see the image too well, but this is a picture of a crowd of people, and one of them is holding up a sign that says, "Game over." Anyone familiar with pictures like this, or want to guess as to what this is?
Some sort of protest?
Yes, protest. There's actually a picture coming from Tahrir Square in Cairo at the protests that lasted for over 2 weeks initially to oust the then president and autocrat Hosni Mubarak. So the thing that I love about my job is that I get to write about whatever is interesting to me. And certainly we'll talk here in a moment about the boundaries that there are within that. Some of those boundaries include my audience, which is primarily an academic disciplinary audience, and also some of the constraints that I have within teaching. But these are all projects that have one way or another spun out and interested me. And I might talk a little bit about them momentarily, but each of them I think demonstrates something about rhetoric, power, and social change, because as I argue for all of them, they all make use of the power of public persuasion in order to make change, even within US conservatism, which a lot of people might not think of as a movement. The type of writing that I do the most often could be defined as analysis and criticism. And analysis and criticism I want to define very broadly here as writing which offers a deep understanding of events, texts, or data generally. I definitely come from a humanistic background, and so I tend to approach things with a greater degree of subjectivity. I bring my own subjective eye to the texts that I analyze and also to the writing process. I also, as a humanistic writer, tend to appreciate things in their singularity, right? I'm not as interested in generalizable truths, although certainly generalizable truths are important. I don't want to dismiss that. But as somebody schooled in the humanities, I'm very interested in getting into rich, deep understandings of rhetorical events that we live through. Analysis and criticism is also built around insight, right? So the rhetorical critic is somebody who can bring a fresh perspective or a new meaning, insight that people haven't perhaps thought of before. And so my writing, oftentimes my interpretation is guided by my level of insight. Analysis and criticism also entails evaluation, right? This is something that I have found, I'm not sure if you would agree with me, but I sense that students in the US often have kind of a bit of an allergic reaction to persuasion. We often like to think that people will, if they could only be given the proper information, they would end up siding with us, right? And so oftentimes you'll see efforts for education and kind of a resistance toward persuasion. But really, the rhetorical critic's job is persuasion. My job is to offer critique, criticism, evaluation. Now, it doesn't always have to be negative. I know that the term criticism often has a negative connotation in our culture as simply cutting things down, but it does entail evaluation, and so I tend to embrace that. I wanted to just offer a bit of a kind of defensive criticism, and my sort of one of my subtle sub-goals of tonight is to try to encourage you to continue along the path of the arts, humanities, and social sciences if you're not already there, and to actually be excited about your AI analytical inquiry society requirements that you're going to have to take at some point, because these classes are outstanding classes taught by very passionate people. Analysis and criticism, actually, we've witnessed in the last I would say certainly the last 12 years, but really even the last 4 to 5 years, an explosion of analysis and criticism outside of academia. This can come in the form of trending, right? Trending being a term that I would use to kind of capture the passage when something goes viral, or the passage of certain news items on social media. And so trending, you even see this when you go to check your Yahoo or your Gmail account and it pops up, now trending, you know, Paris Hilton. And that's even an old reference, that's how old I am. I mentioned Paris Hilton to you all. But also blogging and social media. Even, you know, people without standard blogs can use Facebook now as a platform that is similar to a blog, in that they are going to analyze news of the day and offer quick evaluation or insight. Also, outside of academia, we're seeing trends in terms of data mining. If you're familiar with this concept, just large amounts of data that firms are going to pull over in order to find trends. and maybe marketing products in different ways. Data mining relies very heavily upon analysis, and even things like The Daily Show or other forms of meta-commentaries demonstrate how analysis and criticism is being picked up very broadly in the public sphere. And so this is a form of writing that I think not only has relevance for academia, but also has relevance to you all as just ordinary people, right? How many of you have a Facebook account? You're on Facebook. Yeah, so this form of writing would have relevance to you all, as well as being a citizen, an informed citizen. How am I doing for time? Okay, good. Okay, so I wanted to just offer a little bit more about writing in my own work in the hopes of perhaps leaving you with a few tips and tricks for what you can do, perhaps in your own classes, or what you could do if you wanted to pursue other classes related to humanistic writing. Writing is very much a huge part of my process. I know that the idea of learning styles has kind of fallen out of favor, but for a while there were discussions about unique learning styles. One of those writing or learning styles that I learned about when I took the little inventory was the reading and writing learning style. And this was so fitting for me. I was once called a graphophile by a fellow academic who's originally from Greece because of the amount of notes that I take during conversations that I have with people. And to this day, I will have a pen and paper handy if anyone comes to visit my office for a brainstorm session, and I'm constantly writing. I keep the flyers that I get for campus as scratch paper to write notes in the middle of class so that I can track conversation. Writing is very much how I learn, as well as reading. And so this is a huge part of my process. But I think that even beyond my learning style, writing is so important throughout every stage of my research. The more that you write and the more that you read, I think the better you get at writing and reading. And so that's one little bit of advice that I would offer to you. In terms of my other process, I really immerse myself within the texts that I find interesting. So for instance, the project I did on global warming, whoops, sorry about that. The project that I did on global warming was to look at the way that the press coverage of climate change framed the issue as an apocalyptic event, right? So I talked about elements of the apocalyptic frame. I ended up collecting with a co-author about over 100 newspaper articles to do this particular project. And over the course of 2 months, we would just sit, highlight transcripts, and then I would actually type in quotations from the transcripts, which I know a lot of you would probably find appalling in this day and age. Why not just simply copy and paste things over? But even the process of typing things, getting my fingers involved, that was a really important way to immerse myself in the text. So likewise, I would, here we go. Likewise, when it comes time to get to know the scholarly conversation, I end up taking very extensive notes over the actual scholarly articles that are coming to shape my interests. And so again, this could be files upwards of 20 single-spaced pages, sometimes quotations, other times just my own notes, to get to know the scholarly conversation about the project. You know, I had the picture of Ronald Reagan up on the board there. I've recently been working on a project looking at his speech to the National Association of Evangelicals Convention in 1983, which is otherwise known by the more famous title, The Evil Empire Speech. How many of you have heard of this speech? Have you seen it? Have you actually read it or seen it? Okay, well, you should. It's a really interesting speech. And I make the argument that people have misunderstood or misinterpreted the speech because they focus so much on the evil empire portion and not on the first 2/3 of the speech, in which President Reagan draws all sorts of connections between communism and promiscuous teenage girls getting abortions, and secular liberals telling people in the US what to do. It's a very fascinating speech. And so I had to get to know the scholarly conversation about that particular speech before I could write about it. And the majority of critics in my discipline talk about it in terms of foreign policy. They talk about it in terms of the evil empire portion and what it meant to the Soviet Union. And so getting to know the scholarly conversation is one of those things that shapes my work. We'll see if, for whatever reason, here we go. And then the other process related to writing is drafting, reviews, and revision. And I guess that I can just tell you, along with my main tip of the more you read and the more you write, the better you get at writing, it is to allow yourself and come to, if you can, enjoy the process of revision, because revising is so, so, so important. It's taken me a very long time to embrace revision, but I feel like I'm coming to do so. Writing is also important to my work as a product. It is what I largely produce, again, for an academic readership, although I would hope that my writing products can also inform my teaching. And so actually the example of the evil empire analysis I was just telling you about grew out of my first year seminar, which is called Exploring the Rhetoric of Anarchism and Conservatism. And we did a close reading of Reagan's speech in the class, and it was through that class and multiple times talking with my students about it that I actually came to see this as a significant possibility. So that's a little bit about me and my work, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker will be William Philpott from the History Department. Dr. Philpott focuses on environmental history, which includes everything from the history of energy, eating, and resource use, to natural disasters and the spread of invasive species. From the ever-complicated politics of property and environmental protection to the history of cultural ideas about humans' place in nature.
That was a bit of my writing. I'm going to warn you, I don't have any PowerPoint or anything. I'm a historian, so I deal only with old stuff. I don't have anything updated or new here. But I thought what I would do is sort of talk a little bit about, mostly about research and a little bit about writing in the field of history. So in order to do that, I sort of want to say a little bit about what history is. That might seem like a no-brainer. History is the study of people in the past. But I want to talk a little bit more about sort of what it entails when you approach it in an academic way or a scholarly way. And then I'll try to segue from that into some about the research methods we use in history, and that you will be likely to use if you take a history class here at DU. History, yes, is the study of people in the past, but the way history is often taught, I tend to find that when I say that I teach history, that people say either, oh, I love history, or I hate history, right? And I think that one reason a lot of people sort of turn off to history is because it's often taught as a bunch of facts, just one sort of damn fact after another, a bunch of names, a bunch of dates, a bunch of events. You're supposed to memorize a lot of stuff. And that can be fascinating if you have sort of an inherent interest in that stuff, but it can be really dulling and really it can really put you off if you don't have a sort of a built-in fascination for that. So what I want to sort of push you to think about is history as the study of people in the past, but the study of things that are much deeper and I think much more meaningful, more significant, more fascinating than just sort of what happened and when and who did it. When we look at history from sort of an academic perspective, a scholarly perspective, as I said before, we're interested in things like, what were the causes of events? What was the significance of this event in terms of things that grew out of it? Ramifications, consequences, long-term, short-term, and so forth. What are the motivations inside people's heads when they do things, when they decide not to do things, like to vote or not to vote? to revolt or not to revolt, right? What are the motivations? What are the meanings people give to their own lives in their own context in which they live? And how does that shape their actions and their decisions, or their inactions and indecisions? What are people's ways of understanding the world around them? Sort of the most basic assumptions that we live our own lives, our own daily lives, sort of approaching the world around us based on assumptions that we usually don't even recognize, that we usually don't even think about, that we usually don't even stop to critique, to use your word. But as a historian, I'm very interested in finding those things out and trying to suss out what were people thinking? How did they see the world around them? The most basic things, their sense of identity, of family, of community, of nation. I study environmental history, so I'm interested in what do people think about nature? What do people think about land and resources? Do they even have a concept of resources? They even have a concept of nature, which is a term we throw around a lot, but we don't really spend much time thinking about what it means to us, or how that understanding of its meaning shapes our actions toward it. Okay? I'm interested in those kinds of things. So that's where I think history really comes alive, is when we're past the just memorizing a bunch of stuff, and we're into looking at what people were doing, what they were thinking, what they were saying about themselves and about others, and how that might have had consequences for the way they act. Okay? So that gets me into research methods. And I'll say that if any of you have taken a history class at the college level, you probably already know this. But, and hopefully if you got a good history teacher at the high school level, you know this as well, which is that historical scholarship boils down to one really important thing above all else, and that is what we call primary sources. Primary sources, which are documents left by the people who lived back in the times and in the context we're studying. So for example, if I'm studying World War II, which I don't, but let's say I were, then I would be interested in finding primary sources, things like newspaper articles that were written back in those times, or diaries, or letters that soldiers sent home, or things like that. Those are primary sources because they get as close as we can to the thinking of the people living in those times, living through those events, doing those things, or simply just witnessing the things that we're studying. Okay? That's what primary sources are all about, and that's the meat of historical scholarship, is trying to find those primary sources. And as I said, we're trying to get inside those people's heads by reading, how newspapers, you mentioned, how journalists, for example, described a speech, or a battle, or some other kind of event. I'm interested in looking very closely at the language that's used in those newspaper articles, trying to get a sense of what were those journalists thinking? How might their way of framing those events have shaped or influenced the way that other people sitting at home reading that newspaper might have understood the events going on in the war around them? It's the best we can do to try to get inside those people's heads. And that's how we can try to understand the world that they lived in. Right? And again, not just what happened, but what significances and what meanings people gave to those things. One of the basic things I plead with my students to try to understand is that we can't assume that people thought the way we do. Even if we're looking at, say, Americans living, 10 years ago, and you're an American studying those people, you can't assume that they had the same frames of reference that we do. They may have had a lot of similarities, but there were a lot of things different about the context they lived in, even just 10 years ago. And so we have to think about that. We have to sort of constantly remind ourselves not to assume that people thought the way we do. If we do that, if we sort of try to detect, one of my professors in the past put it this way, imagine yourself as an alien. You've kind of landed on Earth, you're unfamiliar with everything around you, and so you question everything, and you ask a question about everything. Nothing should be assumed. And that's how historians, I think good historians, try to approach primary sources. Don't assume that you understood where these people were coming from. Use the documents to try to pull that out. Use the documents to try to pull out where they were coming from. Okay? So we pay a ton of attention to documents, these primary source documents. We try to arrange a wide range of them so that they can start to corroborate each other, so we can start to see patterns in them. Okay? Part of the problem is that historical evidence is really fragmentary. We have to rely on primary sources that have managed to survive. Which is to say, a lot of stuff is missing. It's gone forever. It's forever absent to us. We don't control what's available to us. So unlike, say, a lot of social scientists, we can't, say, design a poll or a survey. Unlike a natural scientist, we can't control laboratory conditions. Right? As historians, we have to go based on what's left to us. And what's left to us, like I said, is fragmentary, but it's fragmentary in not totally random ways. Literate people leave more documents than illiterate or pre-literate people. Wealthier, more powerful people leave more documents than people who tend to lack power or lack wealth or access to information or things like that. So the stuff that's left to us has biases built into it, has problems built into it, and that's another challenge as historians, is trying to work around that. One of the most fascinating revolutions in historical scholarship that's happened over the past 50 plus years has been the increasing sense we can't just look and say what politicians and presidents and generals and diplomats and so forth were writing and saying. We have to try to find the voices of less powerful people as well, right? More marginalized people, in order to get a fuller understanding of the human experience of the past. Okay, so that's one of the sort of exciting but very challenging things about historical scholarship, is trying to find that wide range of primary sources, like I said before. So we are at the mercy of the sources that have survived. We rely on fragmentary sources. We rely on lucky finds a lot of time as historians. Okay, all of this points to sort of two big sort of lessons I'm going to give at this point, and that is, one, historians are not really in the business of proving things the way some social scientists or mathematicians or natural scientists might sometimes do. We can't know every last detail of what happened. We can't know every last detail of what people were thinking or why they made the decisions they did in the past, simply because the evidence is lacking. The evidence has been lost forever. Okay? We can't possibly recreate everything that happened. We have to build off of the fragmentary evidence we have. We have to look for patterns. We have to suggest those patterns as applying more broadly. But we can't prove for absolute sure. So what we'll try to do is we'll try to shed light, we'll try to seek explanations, offer explanations and interpretations that are suggestive of that, of sort of those broader realities in the past. But as historians, we have to be very humble about this, because we fully realize that future historians are going to come along and modify or revise what we wrote, what we argued, the meanings we gave to the past. Future historians will look at new sets of sources that come to light, or new kinds of people that we didn't consider in our own studies. Or they'll look at the same old sources we did and look at them through a new set of eyes, and the subjectivity you mentioned before, right? And as you know, they'll look at the same newspaper articles that I did, and they'll find things in them, they'll notice things in them that I didn't, because they're looking at them from different frames of reference than I did. Our context as historians, the times we live in now, shapes how we view history. Again, I study environmental history. That field didn't even exist like 25 or 30 years ago, right? Because environmental history didn't come along as a field, sort of factoring in the non-human actors that help shape the human experience. That's essentially what environmental history does. That idea didn't really come into play until you get the rise of sort of a political environmental movement in the 1960s and 1970s, the stronger sort of ethical or even moral sense that we as people, as human beings, live in a wider ecological context, and we can't divorce ourselves from that context. We're reliant on it, and we shape it, and it's reliant on us, and it shapes us, right? Those are ethical, scientific insights, political insights that help then lead some historians to think, well, if that's true, if we as historians live in a wider ecology, if that's part of our context, not just other people part of our context, but weather patterns and landforms and species and the movements of species and things like that, those are part of our human experience as well, then you start to see the possibility of looking at history environmentally. You start to see environmental history, okay? Surely there will be new ways of looking at history that will emerge in the next 25, 30, 50, 100 years. People will continue to find new ways of understanding the world around them, and they'll apply those to looking at the past. So, like I said, as a historian, I have to be humble in knowing that whatever I write is never going to be the last word on something. It can't be, because somebody else, some other historian will come along in the future and revise what I have to say. So that's one thing. We're not in the business of proving things in the field of history. A second thing, and this will apply to you as students and as scholars of your own, especially if you take history classes, is that historical research is two words that spring to mind. It's exhausting and it's inefficient. Because we're looking for whatever fragmentary sources survive, We're trying to assemble as much corroborating evidence as we can. And also because we're constantly looking for that lucky find, that really good source that sheds a lot of light. We have to be patient, right? We have to keep reading, we have to keep looking, we have to gather everything that might be relevant. To do good history, to do good historical research, you need to enjoy the hunt. You need to be fascinated by your topic. You need to be willing to read more about it. You need to be willing to chase down potential leads, right? You need to be endlessly curious and voracious, I would say. You also need to be willing to accept that a lot of things are going to be dead ends or false starts. You're going to end up, spending time barking up the wrong tree. I once spent, and this is sort of a classic graduate school story, I once spent an entire summer, I kid you not, an entire summer typing census data from, I think, like 1930 through 1960 into spreadsheets on my computer, and they ended up being utterly irrelevant to my dissertation. It was a total waste of a summer, in retrospect. But I couldn't have known that until I went through the exercise, until I, that data, that utterly, what ended up being useless data, ended up pointing me in other directions that ended up being very useful. Okay. Now, I'm not encouraging you to be okay with wasting an entire summer. But I will say that to do historical research, you end up doing things like this, and you end up having false starts and barking up the wrong tree, and so forth. A couple more things about sort of doing history. We historians tend to structure our projects in different ways than social scientists, to take a sort of closely related but somewhat different example. Social scientists will often structure projects in terms of sort of starting with a hypothesis and then seeking either to, if not prove or disprove it, then at least to support it or to overturn it. As historians, we tend to start with a topic that interests us rather than with a hypothesis. And then we start asking questions, often very open-ended questions. Why did people do this? Why did this thing happen? What were the ramifications of this event or of this development? Very open-ended questions, okay, that we don't know the answer to. We may suspect some answers. The very act of asking the questions implies that we suspect certain things are important about this topic, but we don't know the answers. And if you do really good history, I think, and this is what we're sort of striving to do, is you then use your primary sources to get at those answers. You let your evidence lead you to your answers. You don't have a predetermined answer and then you go out to try to find the evidence to back it up. But instead you ask those open-ended questions, then you assemble your evidence, you read through it, you take copious notes, you reread it, you take more notes, right? You keep assembling, you keep culling information as much as you can, as much evidence as you can find. You keep bouncing it off each other. You reread stuff having read later stuff, okay? And through that, I think the best history is that history that comes to conclusions based on that evidence, that doesn't know where it's going until almost the very end. This can make the process of writing as inefficient as the process of research, because in the process of writing, I think you're implying this as well, that the process of writing helps you figure, the physical and intellectual exercise of writing helps you figure things out in your own head. It helps you sort things out in your own head. I often don't know what I think of a source until I start to type stuff about it. I don't write longhand so much anymore, but I type. And I'll type stuff about it, and in the process of typing and then deleting and then revising what I'm typing, these are just notes I'm taking. I start to figure out what is the significance of this source, or maybe it's insignificant and it really hasn't taught me much at all. But I can't really figure that out without the process of writing about it. And then when you sit down to actually write your paper, having gone through the outlining process and all that kind of stuff, I often find that the outline shifts in the process of writing, right? Because again, you can't totally know how your thoughts are going to come together until the act of trying to put them together starts to unfold. Okay? Now, I think that's very true of history. I suspect it's true of a lot of other disciplines as well. My expertise is in history, but I suspect it's true of a lot of disciplines, certainly in the humanities. I would echo a few other comments, just sort of in closing. Read what other people have written, right? It's really important, whatever you're studying, whatever you're researching, whatever you yourself are writing on, to try to figure out what other people have said about that or a similar topic. Because that makes you, in an exciting way, I think, a very potentially exciting way, a part of a scholarly conversation that you become a part of. You're not just a student, you are a scholar. You're not just a student of history, you're a historian. right? If you insert yourself in those conversations and read what other historians have written, and then think to yourself, what questions did they leave unanswered? What questions did they leave unasked? Do I agree with this historian? Does his or her explanation of things make sense? Do I find evidence to the contrary? Or do I find evidence that corroborates what this historian has said? Those can be exciting avenues for sort of putting yourself in that conversation. But I think it builds sort of intellectual self-confidence, for one thing, but it's also an essential part of scholarship, is becoming part of a debate or part of a wider conversation that goes beyond just you. Now, one thing I'll say about historians, is historians are often mocked, and I think they do rightly so, are often mocked for doing topics that sound really, really kind of narrow and obscure. My own present research is on the history of tourist development along the I-70 corridor west of Denver since World War II. Now you look at it and you're like, man, that's narrow, right? That's a really limiting topic. And on the surface, yes. But what we as historians generally try to do is we try to take these narrow examples and try to use them to look at them in great detail and use them to try to open up much wider insights. So for instance, in my case, I'm interested in what happens when you take a landscape that was previously known mostly for extracting resources, mining, logging, water, things like that, and you transform it into a landscape that's primarily known for recreation, for leisure, for spiritual uplift, for emotional uplift, for personal self-fulfillment. How does that happen? How does it happen that people come to review a landscape in that way and value it in new ways? And then I mentioned, what are the consequences of that? When so many people start to think of, say, this part of Colorado as a place where they go to ski, or they go to hike, or they go to fish, or they go to be with their kids during summer vacation, or whatever. What implications does that have for their thinking, not just about themselves and sort of their lifestyles and their living standards, but also for their understanding of the environment, for their environmental attitudes? They start to think, well, I love this place. This place means a lot to me. We keep coming back here to fish. We keep coming back here to ski. I don't want them to screw this place up. I don't want them to widen the highway. I don't want them to build too much resort sprawl. I don't want them to start drilling oil or gas there, right? Sometimes people start to become personally invested in landscapes in ways that lead to environmental, political implications, right? So one of the things I'm really interested in with the transformation of this area into a recreational landscape is, what are the political implications of that? How do people's environmental attitudes change, and what consequences does that have for the rise of environmental politics, environmental movement? In the broadest possible sense, what I'm really, really interested in is what happens when you take consumer culture, consumers' ways of bonding with things, with purchases, with commodities, with goods, including the purchase of a vacation experience. What happens when you take consumer culture, consumer mindset, and you apply it to nature? What implications does that have for the ways we think about nature, and the ways we treat it, and the ways we live on the land, and the ways we fight over land and resources and environment? Those are really big issues. Now, I'm not saying that the area west of Denver, the I-70 corridor, has the answers to all those issues. But by studying that one area, I can raise lots of questions, I can offer lots of possibilities, that then maybe future scholars will read, hopefully, read my stuff, right? And think, well, that's interesting, I agree with this, let's pursue that farther, or I disagree with this, let's pursue that farther, right? I become part of that conversation, I become part of that debate, and hopefully help other people think about the history of human understandings of nature in a new way as well. Okay. So those are sort of some broad observations, I guess, about the process of historical research, conceiving of a topic, thinking through the process of research, a little bit about writing, which I'd be happy to answer more questions about. But I do think that some of the things I have to say apply more broadly to other fields besides history. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And our last speaker is Professor Michael Kenyon from the Mathematics Department. And Dr. Kenyon studies non-associative algebra, loops, and quasi-groups, and Leibniz algebras.
So this is an interesting experience because so here I am, a mathematician, and of course I was preceded by two folks in the humanities, and I was asked by the writing program to talk a little bit about what it's like to do research in mathematics And I thought first about doing that in sort of general terms. Well, mathematicians tend to do this, and mathematicians tend to do that. And when I realized that was going to get really dull really fast. If you think about what your mental image of a generic mathematician is like, it's probably been shaped by a lot of things in pop culture. Like, for example, if you've seen the movie Good Will Hunting or A Beautiful Mind, you probably think that most of us are obsessive compulsives who have extremely narrow focus and are just teetering this close to being fully committed. Okay? You're not far from wrong, but there's a lot more to it than that. And so I decided what I would do is actually talk a little bit more about how I specifically engage in research in mathematics. Now this, of course, is a little bit tricky because as the blurb that I wrote a long time ago describing myself and that was just read about me describes, it probably included a bunch of words that you didn't know the meaning of. So how am I actually going to talk about how I do research in mathematics without getting into the mathematics? And the answer is, we'll see. I'm going to actually try to manage to do this. So my own particular work is heavily uses computers and software to do the work for me. So in particular, what I'm interested in is using computers and using software to help me do my job. And my job as a mathematician is to prove theorems. So unlike a historian who isn't trying to prove anything, as they say, we're on the other end of the scale. Okay? The mathematician's job is absolute certainty. We are trying to prove things. We are trying to know things. And we start from first principles and derive whatever it is we need to know from those principles, assuming we can get them. Okay, first of all, props to anybody who gets the reference in the title. Okay? If you get it, then you have awesome geek cred. Okay? It's from Dr. Strangelove. So what we do, the tools I use are automated theorem provers. I'm going to show you one in just a minute, okay, how they work. In particular, there's one that's called Prover 9 that I use very, very heavily. 9 doesn't mean that it's the 9th iteration of a program that was once called Prover. Have you ever heard of that really awful film, Plan 9 from Outer Space? Okay. If not, go get it. Okay. Find it, rent it, watch it. Be glad then that you did so and brag to all your friends. Okay. That's what it's all about. And find things that actually help us build counterexamples, because one of the important things about being a mathematician is not just being able to arrive at the truth quickly through proof, but also to figure out where you're going astray. Okay? To come up with an idea, to have a conjecture about what should be true, and then immediately to find something that shows that you were completely wrong. Okay? Then plus some brain power. Oh, I see I forgot to edit this. So what I'm going to give you, actually let me pause this for just a second here. Because I want to show you first here. Sorry, just a moment. There we go. Nope, almost had it. That's it. Okay. This is the GUI for the software that I use all the time, Prover 9. So let me just briefly explain how it works, and then I'm going to let it run in the background while I do the rest of this presentation. Okay, I'm not going to actually explain what any of the mathematical symbols there that are typed into the white space mean, because it isn't particularly significant for this presentation. Okay, you see a lot of equations and a lot of symbols, and if you've had something like even high school algebra, you're already starting to blanch, and that's cool. I dig it. Okay, I am too. And so these are axioms. Okay, the big white space with all the stuff I typed there a few minutes before all this started are the axioms of a mathematical theory. They are the things that we take as the given, the foundation, if you like, of the theory, the postulates. Another way of putting it. The thing on the bottom in the smaller white space is a goal. Okay, and this particular problem, it's not important what it is or what its larger significance is, but I will tell you this: that this particular problem represents a mathematical problem that was open from about 1956 until the year 1999. There had been absolutely no progress on it. It was one of the major open problems in my field. Okay, now I'm going to ask the computer to prove it. Okay? And we're just going to let it go. You'll see the temperature bar that's sliding back and forth. This means it's working. Okay, so much for that. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a little reenactment of how I got into this business, in particular how I got into the issue of using computers to actually prove theorems. And don't worry, eventually I will connect all this up with writing. So here are the principal players. The person on the right is J.D. Phillips. At the time that all this was taking place, he was at St. Mary's College, which is in Moraga, California. He's currently the chair of the mathematics department at Northern Michigan University. The guy on the left, who doesn't have as much gray hair as he does now, should look familiar. At the time this was taking place, I wasn't here at DU, I was at Indiana University, South Bend. Okay, and JD actually posed the particular problem that I just set the computer working on to me, okay, and described it to me in some detail. And this entire collaboration, by the way, is taking place by email, I should mention. If you have a mental picture of a mathematician as being one of the two types of academics that lives alone in the ivory tower, staring off into the distance and thinking deep thoughts, the other being the philosophers, okay? Yeah, it's true, okay, but a lot has changed, and a lot more of mathematics is now done collaboratively than I would say used to be. So he posed this problem to me, and I said, yeah, that sounds like a very good problem, why don't we work on it? And so we began a long series of email exchanges, okay? Blah, 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 move on loops, blah, 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 it doesn't matter what's blah, 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 inner mappings, blah, blah, blah. This went on for several weeks, okay? On and on and on. And we didn't get anywhere. Okay? It was just hopeless. We were just basically talking in circles, round and around and around and around, and we got absolutely nowhere. We had lots of brilliant ideas, and none of them worked. Okay. We didn't necessarily find counterexamples, we just got dead ends. We ran out of ideas. So now what? And JD didn't know it either. Now the context of this is that the whole time we were having this email conversation, we were CCing a third person. The third person was one of the founding fathers of my particular field, actually one of the founding mothers. Her name was Hala Flugfelder. At the time she was in her 80s, and she wasn't participating in the whole conversation until this point where we got stuck. And she said, why don't you boys, which she's allowed to say because she was 80, okay. Why don't you boys ask Ken Kunin? He was, I didn't know who that was. Okay. JD knew who it was, but thought he worked in a different field. And Hala told us that he was starting to use computers to prove theorems, to actually do mathematics in a serious and meaningful way. Okay. And we were very skeptical about this at first, but thought, what the heck. So we just did a cold call. I wrote an email message to Ken Kunin, who is at the University of Wisconsin, still there now, retired, and basically told him about the whole problem. And described everything that I just described to you when I was showing you the problem as it was when I set it to running. Okay? And his reaction was interesting with an ellipsis right after it. I learned much later, this isn't relevant to the story, but I learned much later that after several years of corresponding with him, that anytime he wrote interesting with an ellipsis after it, that means he actually meant it. If he wrote interesting with a period, then he wasn't serious. And then we didn't hear from him for a little while. So a few days passed, and JD and I were sort of discussing what to do, and we decided we better wait. And of course, there's also the issue of academic protocol. We were both young assistant professors, not long out of graduate school, and how were we supposed to address him? Well, he was still Professor Kunin to us. And then finally, a few days later, this is about, I want to say about 5 or 6 days later, we got an email message from him with the subject an ugly proof. And also, It started actually by addressing us with our first names, and that's where our collaboration actually began. And so that's that part of things. How to address people also was right. Let me now go back to the program because I think, yes, it's done. Here it is. Okay? Looks terrible, doesn't it? Hold on a second, because it's going to look even worse. Okay? It took, according to the clock there, it took just slightly over 2 minutes. Okay? With the software that was available at the time we were doing this, which was back in 1999, it took a couple of days. And remember, this is a problem that had been around for almost 40-something years. Now, here's the whole proof. See? Isn't every step just crystal clear? Isn't it obvious what this all means? I mean, look at that. That's just, how could you ask for anything that was more beautiful than that? And so it goes. And then finally we get to the conclusion. I mean, yeah, what else could you want, right? Right, okay, in sarcasm mode. So, what comes next? Well, in the meantime, while Ken was basically trying to perform voodoo on the software to get it to do all this, now it's quite easy. We had gone back, and I in particular had gone back and was now familiar with what was going on in the tradition of using automated deduction tools in mathematics. It's not just an issue, and this is now finally tying into the theme of all this. It's not just an issue of getting a computer to do the work for you. Okay? Yeah, that's a big part of it. But the other part of it is now I've got something, the computer has spit something out in its own peculiar way. What does it mean? What does it tell me about the problem that I started with? Okay? What sort of insights can I gain from this text dump, if anything? Okay? And so what happens is that we need to actually translate it. Now, a lot of people, computer scientists in particular, who work in automated deduction say, you know, once the program is done running, you're done. Okay, go do something else. The mathematical perspective is what I call the humanization imperative, okay, which says that if you have a proof that a computer gave you, you should try to humanize it so that your fellow mathematicians can actually understand it and read it. Okay? And maybe in the process, you'll actually learn something. You'll learn something about the problem that you posed in the first place. You'll learn something about the whole big picture and gain some new insights about where to go next. Okay? So, JD and I had a discussion about this very point. Because he was concerned, you know, what are we supposed to do? We've just solved this big problem, except we didn't solve it. Okay? There was this computer that did it for us. Are we just supposed to write a paper and try to get it published saying, it's over now, the computer did the work for us, so much for that? The answer is no. We knew we had to translate it, and so we started doing that. And this, I'm coming to the end of this anecdote. And so Ken and I started, he's Ken now, right? You got that part? Okay. Ken and I started actually going back and forth about this. You know, blah, 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 trying to figure out what does all this mess that's on the paper mean. And in the meantime, JD came out of nowhere and explained it all to us. And he actually did the smart thing. Ken and I started at the very beginning of that thing that I showed you. I started going through line by line trying to understand it until our eyes were swimming. Okay? JD did the smart thing. He started at the back and moved forward, back to the front. The advantage of that is that sometimes you eventually reach things you already know before you get to the beginning. And then you don't have to actually go through and do every single detail because you reach stuff that you were already familiar with. Put another way, in more human terms, by doing it the way he did it, which was the smart way to do it in retrospect, he actually grounded the subject in the human side of mathematics, in terms of what was already known. Okay. And hindsight is always 20/20. So the problem is, in fact, this is where the writing aspect comes into things. Okay. In theory, I could go through and check what the computer spit out line by hand. Okay. There was a lot of stuff that didn't mean anything to you, and it shouldn't. But there was instructions telling me how to get from one step to the next that I could just go through with paper and pencil and check, make sure it was right. Now, why would I even doubt it, right? But that doesn't mean I'm going to understand anything. A proof that a computer gives you is not a proof that's designed for all of us to eventually, with training, to eventually read. Okay? So my time and effort, and really a bulk of what I do in my research, isn't so much telling the computer to do stuff. Okay, that doesn't take time. Okay, you saw how easy that was. What the real work comes in is translation, is in getting a human form of of the output. Okay, and oftentimes what I actually end up submitting for publication doesn't resemble what came out of the computer very much at all, other than maybe in a few key steps. So what does this all have to do with writing? And the answer is everything. Okay? The process of writing a proof for human understanding, or of writing appealing papers, is in fact mostly, as has already been alluded to, a process of rewriting. It's all about the rewriting. Okay, and why is that? Well, okay, so I'm reading a computer output, and I sort of, oh, I get it now. I know what's going on. I understand this. This is fine. Or if I'm doing something not involving the computer, I go for a walk, and you know, Poincaré once said, legs are made for thinking. So I go for a long walk, and I get an idea. Oh yeah, this is great. And I go home and I actually write it down, and suddenly it doesn't make any sense. Okay? It doesn't make any sense at all. The argument is totally unclear. So you expand it. You have to rewrite. You expand. You add more details. Okay, now I get it. Now I get it. Now I'm filling it in. But what's the problem with that? Well, remember, we're trying to write something that for the audience. Who's the audience? Well, in my case, it's other mathematicians. Okay, nasty bunch. Okay, they're going to go over it and pick at it, and in particular, maybe in some other part of the paper, I was belaboring the obvious. Okay, like, oh, you spent an entire page explaining yada-da here, and we already know no yada-da. Don't bother with that. Just summarize it. Okay. So we cut some parts, and add some more here, and cut some more there, and add some more here. It's all about the revision. Okay. The rewriting is the key to everything. If you're doing it all right in the first draft, you're doing it wrong. Is really the right way to think about it. Lather, rinse, repeat. Okay? Eventually it got published, all this work. This was a while ago. Record acceptance, 1 week after we submitted it. And it's difficult to imagine, there are parts of it that it's difficult to imagine a human discovering. And the use of the software did turn out to be essential. And so finally, let me just close with a couple of remarks about what it is I do and what are some of the philosophical implications of this. Okay. So in my work, especially in some of the stuff I do now, okay, that proof that I showed you looked nasty, right? But it was only a few hundred lines. Okay. A lot of the stuff I do now, you get proofs that are several thousand lines long. Okay. And if you think you balked at that one, imagine, okay, balking at one which is 10,000 lines long. Okay. Sometimes there are various tricks you can use to try to shorten these things a little bit, but most oftentimes they don't work. And what does that mean? It means that there's a paradigm shift. There comes a point when maybe, occasionally, we have to trust the software. Okay? And the question is, at what point do we just do that? Do we just say, I can't translate this. There is a law of diminishing returns. Okay? My brain will just simply melt if I actually attempt to translate all this into human form. Okay? Well, for me, the answer is I always do. I always trust the software. But I still want proofs that I can actually understand. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you. We have about 25 minutes for questions for any one of our speakers. So anybody brave soul want to begin? First question. It can be a question about the research itself, research in the discipline, writing about the subject. Yes, Eric.
Yeah, so I do have a question. I'm wondering if the panel, if you could tell us something a little bit about like your writing practices and processes in a very sort of material form, and so it's like, what time do you write? In what sort of space do you write? What do you need to be able to do this writing? Is it something you do by yourself? Is it more social or different aspect? You know, a cup of coffee at hand early in the morning. cup of something else later at night? Like what kind of things do you use to get this writing going?
I have found through much trial and error over time that I write the best first thing in the morning. And it usually involves coffee, and there is a very ritualistic element with the coffee, because the coffee pot's in the other room, and so, you know, it's kind of a motivator to get through a certain number of pages, go get more coffee, come back, more coffee and come back. But yeah, the morning time, and I've written some more recently with more co-authors, but I do think that the best writing that I do tends to be by myself. I'm not sure why that, I think that has to do with what I was saying about the revision process, and again, how important it is. I think I at one point thought that, you know, I was the primary audience for my writing. And so if it read really well to me, then it must be awesome. Occasionally that's true, but more often than not, it's, you know, you're not writing for yourself only, you're writing for a broader audience. And so I think that as I've eased off on that a little bit, it's been easier for me to work with collaborators. That's my process.
When I give advice to students, it often goes like this: here's how I did things, don't do it that way. And this is an example of this because I tend to get most of my writing done very late at night. There's a very simple reason why. I have little kids, I work at home with little kids. It's really hard to write with little kids running around. And I find that I need a good sense of focus, not a lot of distraction. Not that I don't want noise, but I don't want little kids asking me for snacks and, you know, beating each other up. Right. So I get my writing done very late at night. I don't think that's necessarily a good idea unless you're one of those people whose rhythms work that way. If you are, then go for it. I think that writing has to be something, your idea of a ritual, I think I've found is really important to a lot of writers, of having sort of a set of circumstances or a set time or a place where you can tackle a larger piece of writing. Smaller pieces of writing are different, but larger pieces of writing where you have to sustain the writing project over a series of sessions. I think oftentimes getting into sort of a ritual or a rhythm of some kind is often a really good idea. I've also, and again, I'm not an example of this, but I've had many friends who do exactly what you do. They write first thing in the day. Because writing is something that a lot of us sort of have a hard time finding time for, or we get scared away from it or something. But if you force yourself to do it first thing in the day, no matter what happens the rest of the day, you've had your writing session. Now, I don't do this. But I think it's a good idea to try if you're one of those people who A, can get up in the morning, make yourself get up in the morning, and B, has a project that requires writing, you know, a longer thing over a series of sit-downs rather than just sort of one burst.
So I guess I do most of my writing, and probably my best writing, in the wee hours. I have that type of insomnia where I can fall asleep when I go to bed at a normal hour very quickly, but then I wake up, usually about 2 o'clock in the morning or something like that, and I can't get back to sleep. So I might as well get up and get something done. And that's when I think I do some of my best writing is at that time. And minimal distractions, right? Pretty quiet. For me, I guess as far as the collaborative aspect or that sort of thing, most of my writing and most of my papers have been written with co-authors. Now, they're not all awake at 2 o'clock in the morning so that I can work with them. They may be on the other side of the world, for example, so coincidentally they are awake at 2 o'clock in the morning. It just happens to be the middle of the day for them. But most of that is not collaborative in the sense of a shared document that we're all working on simultaneously. It's usually, okay, I'm going to be it for a while, write, and then send it on, and send it back for revision. And I think the hardest part for me is this sense of ownership, because I have this mental idea that all my co-authors are terrible writers and I must fix everything they do. And of course, this is far from the truth. Many of them are much, much better writers than I am. Okay? And I'm sure they would say the same in reverse, which, yes, it's a contradiction, but that doesn't make it any less true. The ritualistic aspect of it, yeah, in some sense I think there's a lot to that. I don't do coffee anymore, especially not 2 in the morning, because if I can get back to bed at 5, I'll do it. But I think it is important to sort of write with a certain pattern, to sort of do things in a way that will encourage the writing. So for me, what really helped a lot, because I used to avoid the writing part of actually doing mathematical research. I would rather just get tons and tons of results and put off the writing part. That I got a paradigm shift, and for me what really helped is I started mentally pretending that the process of writing was actually like playing a game. Like that for me, writing and getting stuff down and trying to get it in there and get it as good as possible was what I was trying to give myself the sense that it was the same psychological urge that you get when you're playing a video game. And eventually I convinced myself, and it worked to some extent. Not perfectly, but it gets me doing the job.
Yes. Well, first of all of your work is very interesting, so thank you for coming to present to us. And second, I have a question, and it may be better, whatever. My question is, sometimes when you're doing research, it feels like you're reading a lot of stuff that is not necessarily relevant to the topic. Do you guys maybe have like a method of, I guess, going through the material in a way that would make it easier to, I guess, identify that extraneous detail in a way to make it faster to read the material and find what you're looking for? Sorry.
I think that's a really good question. I've found, to kind of echo Bill's words as well, the research process in communication, especially within rhetoric, is horribly inefficient. And, I would complain when I was in graduate school about the amount of reading that I was assigned, because I read every single word of everything that was assigned.
That's why we have those academics.
Yeah, it is up until the end when it was like, oh, I can't read this entire book because I'm now out of time. And so I read, chronological order, word for word, everything. Since then, I think the strategies that I might suggest is really paying good attention to the search terms that you're using to cull, especially if this is like a literature review and you're looking for scholarly resources, or even, I guess, newspaper. If you're using a search engine, just to pay special attention to the limiting features within the search engine. And, I found, just to put in a plug, the Penrose has an amazing staff, and I've worked a lot with Jenny Bowers, who is the social sciences reference librarian, and she's given us several workshops, and they are so helpful at discerning which search terms would be the best to get at, what information. Also, just paying close attention to the abstract, if it is a scholarly article, that abstract should ideally tell you all that you need to know. Or the first paragraph within, the newspaper article, and hopefully that can speed things up. But I am a big fan of inefficient reading, and there's so many things that you can find that are interesting that you don't know. They might not contribute to the writing project that's due tomorrow, but they will contribute down the road to the writing project a year from now, and you don't know that at this point.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Part of the answer to your question that I would say would be, it depends on what you're reading it for. So, to use my discipline as an example, if I'm reading a primary source book, one of those primary sources I was talking about before, I'm going to read that pretty closely all the way through, because I have no idea where the nugget's going to be, if there's a nugget. Right? I have no idea where the quotation is going to be, or the passage, or this really sheds a lot of light for me on what these people are thinking. I don't know what that's going to be. On the flip side, if I'm reading, or if I assign my students to read a longer book, like a historical monograph, a sort of a book-length exploration and exposition of a particular argument, then yeah, you look for the book's version of the abstract, which is going to be the introduction. Oftentimes, if it's a well-written book, the introduction will give you a pretty good sense of what that book is about. Read maybe the first paragraph, sometimes the last paragraphs of chapters to get a sense of what each chapter is about. This is sort of how you gut or skim a book, right? To get the essential details out of it. Or the essential sort of gist of it, not the details. When I send books to my students, I don't want them to memorize every last little thing, every last little historical detail that happened, far from it. But I want them to see what argument that historian is making and how he or she is basically using evidence to support their arguments, because that's what the evidence is there for. That's what all the details are there for, is to make an argument. So you need to know what that argument is, right? And then that'll give you a good sense of whether, if that argument is sort of right up your alley of what you're researching, read the book in more detail. If it's not, maybe you don't have to, right? Maybe you don't have to.
Yeah, I have almost nothing to add to what they've said. The only other thing I would say is that if you're talking about, for example, research that you're doing as part of a class, so in particular if it's a research project that you're working on, and you have some sources in front of you, and you just have too many, and you can't separate the wheat from the chaff, don't be afraid to go and ask the professor for a little bit of advice about it. I mean, this is something that I stress to when I have students working with me on research projects. Okay, if you find something and you're not sure if it's relevant or not, ask me. Come tell me. And when I'm at the point when I'm doing my own work, where I come across, I'm working in a field where I'm slightly unfamiliar with, and I come across 75 papers all with the same keywords, and oh great, I don't want to read all this. And I ask experts if I can, is all this relevant? Does all this mean anything? And they'll usually say, well, this and this are, but these other things, no, not really. And that, I think, can help a lot to narrow things down.
Other questions?
I'll throw a question out. Maybe it's difficult to answer, but in all of your your presentations, you're really talking about research that lasts months, years. And I thought it was interesting, Michael, that the paper that ended up was like 5 pages long after all of this conversation with proofs and stuff. But what advice would you have for students, who are in a 10-week quarter taking multiple classes, trying to, have put an honest effort in and do good research, but have very limited time?
That's a very good question, and I mean, I was describing this very sort of laborious, inefficient research, and I was talking about losing a whole summer to inefficiency,
Yeah.
false start, that kind of thing, and you obviously, the 10-week quarter is the opposite is true for that. And I'll admit to having a difficult time with that. I moved here from a place where they had semesters, and at least there's 15 or 16 weeks there. Here you'd have just 10. So I do a lot of sort of redesigning and rethinking of how much reading and how much research I could expect out of my students. But I think, this is a cliche, but it's really true. Time management is a huge skill that people need to work on, I think. And I'm not trying to, indict anyone here, but I think, I think it's one of the most underrated skills in college is making sure you use time and making sure you use it as efficiently as you can. Now, efficiency might mean reading something that ends up not being relevant, but at least you've got your brain in it. You're working on it, you're thinking about it, even if that piece of information or that document or whatever ended up being, that's not so central to what I'm going to end up writing. But you're still working on it. You're still working on the task. So I think learning to sort of make yourself. Maybe you're already good at this, but I suspect many of you are not. But, it's a hard thing to do to sort of make yourself use those bits of time efficiently. And the 10-week quarter, I think, puts an absolute premium on that because there's so much time. In a lot of schools where they have these shorter quarters, they have fewer classes at a time. But you don't. You've got 4 class loads, sometimes more, in 10 weeks. It's a lot. So time management is essential. Using your time effectively, using it to move forward. That's somewhat different from saying that every last thing you read is going to move you forward, right? But keeping your head in the game, working with something like a larger research project, like someone like me might assign in a history class, don't leave it for the last couple weeks. Work on it in pieces over the course of the quarter. Even if the professor doesn't make you do that, even if there aren't sort of preliminary deadlines built in, make yourself get at it early in the quarter and work on it in pieces over the course of the quarter. Because through the repetition, the keeping your mind in it, the rethinking, the rewriting, that stuff all takes time. It stretches out. It takes at least the 10 weeks you have.
And to kind of build on that, and this is, I think, a luxury for me and the research that I do, and also this is central to my own approach to teaching, and so I know it wouldn't apply to everybody, but that is to pursue a topic that you really do love, and cultivate your interests over time. I mean, I think that one of the dangers that we end up in is this kind of checklist mentality where we have to, you know, check off the next requirement, check off the next assignment just in order to get done, rather than really investing ourselves in something that we enjoy, and that these interests could span entire years while you're at the University of Denver, you know, and so to try to be less, I guess, to be more careful about the classes that you choose and the topics that you choose, I think that can also really help with that 10-week constraint.
Yeah, pretty much ditto. The only thing I would also add is, every once in a while, reassess your priorities. And be careful not to get sucked, as the quarter wears on, be careful not to get sucked into the immediate gratification of something that is going to distract you from really keeping up with your time management. To give you one example, let's see, I guess this was it last year? The day that Valve released Portal 2, okay, in all my classes, less than half my students attended. Okay. And this typically happens on the day of any release of some big game, right? Enrollment drops like a rock around here. Everybody knows this. This is just commonplace. Well, should it? I mean, really? Okay, it's a 10-week quarter. Can you really not wait until the end of the quarter to play the game? Okay, are you really losing any street cred by not waiting a little while? Okay, so if you're sort of faced with these kinds of choices, you know, think carefully about what it is that really needs to get done as you go about the very necessary micromanaging of your time.
All right, would somebody else like to ask a question? All right, well, I guess we will end there.